Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Injustice Podcast. I'm your host, David Greenwald. For the past 10 years, we've operated Vanguard Court Watches in California, including San Francisco, Sacramento, and Yolo counties. Our goal? Expose everyday court injustices, and now, more broadly, shine a spotlight on injustices in the entire criminal justice system, in the form of wrongful convictions, police and prosecutorial misconduct, and mass incarceration. This podcast hopes to take it a step further and highlight criminal justice reform on a national level.
Everyday injustice.
Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Stephanie Marudas and Emily Previti. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having us, David.
Thanks, David. We're happy to be here.
So, you guys just started a podcast series, Obscured. What's that about?
So when we decided to start Obscured, Emily and I had not been working formally together yet. We started working together officially in 2021, and we had worked previously in public media together. And what we started to see is that there's a growing need for stories. Excuse me, I'll take it again. What we started to see is that there is a growing need to tell underreported stories. We're seeing too many issues remain unknown to the public, basically because of underreporting. And so our idea is to focus the show on critical issues that are often missed in the daily news cycles. We're a combination of in-depth journalism where we do reporting and also have conversations like the one we're having with you, with either policy professionals, researchers, and other journalists. And that was our idea, that there's going to be more reporting needed like this as media outlets continue to consolidate and fold.
Yeah, I would say that pretty much covers it. I would just add that as far as the formats, we also are hosting panels to supplement the podcast with conversations, similarly to Q&As that we do with experts and advocates, journalists, people with lived experience, and hope that brings listeners together ultimately in person as well. And as Stephanie said, unfortunately, there are increasing opportunities to report on issues or stories that are given the way the industry has gone, basically almost since we started our careers.
And why don't we take a moment for each of you to kind of give your background and how you got into journalism in the first place?
Sure. I got into journalism sort of accidentally. I had a day job, and I started volunteering in New York City with a Greek community radio station called Cosmos FM. And I had the opportunity to be a reporter, a producer, a host of a community affairs show, which I totally loved. It was for the Greek diaspora. And I loved it so much more than my day job that I decided to make the switch to becoming a public radio reporter. And I was fortunate to be able to make that transition. And I ended up starting my first public radio job at WYPR in Baltimore, which is the NPR affiliate there. It's actually where I grew up as well. So that was really exciting to be able to cover news in my hometown. And then I gradually made this shift to WHYY in Philadelphia, where I worked as a general assignment reporter and then eventually a producer before moving on to start Kouvenda Media, our podcast production company.
Similarly to Stephanie, it wasn't the thing that I necessarily wanted to do since I can remember, although I was writing on my own of my own volition from childhood. And, I can remember getting an early interest in politics, generated by my grandparents. They started talking to me about the kind of stuff at a very young age. And I just remember those conversations with them that continued on until I was in college. And I I worked for WXPN, which is a public radio station in Philadelphia. It's focused on music, but I worked for the morning news show during undergrad. And pretty much immediately after finishing college, I went to work for newspapers and eventually covered Atlantic City and Harrisburg during that city's municipal bankruptcy, and then got back into radio, doing some investigative and enterprise reporting for the Harrisburg NPR affiliate WITF as part of a statewide team, Keystone Crossroads. And that's where Stephanie and I collaborated, along with the rest of the team, on this long form narrative podcast series called Grapple. And that, is kind of what started us working together, realizing that we made a good team and had very similar approaches and reporting interests, although, as she said, it wouldn't be until several years later that we actually started doing that together full time.
One of the interesting things is that I wasn't destined, I guess, to be in journalism either. And so here we are, three different people, all with different paths to similar things. And that's one of the things I actually try to convey to the interns that I work with, is that you don't need to figure out what you're going to do for the rest of your life in college, which I think is an important life lesson.
Absolutely. And I think in ways, right, that you don't even know, especially until you get out working. And, it is, there are some people who are predestined, but a lot of us, it takes a moment to figure it out.
Yeah. And I think that even in our careers, not that we've been doing this for 10 seconds or anything, but we're mid-career, and it's the drastic changes in the industry. I mean, it's just been unbelievable. And so the way it looks now is so different and would appeal to, it's a very different appeal. It's a very different undertaking today than it would have been 30 years ago. So yeah, absolutely, David. It's not, you just don't know.
And I'm old enough that this technology didn't even exist when I was in college. So
similarly.
And I'm wondering, from your perspective, I was talking to you guys before we went on the air here, and one of the things we like to focus on are kind of underreported issues that, things that nobody else really are taking up. And that seems to be one of your goals as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as we sort of touched on earlier and we were chatting about before we started recording, it's just the underreported stories. They're there. They're not getting attention. And unfortunately, as I think I said earlier, there are more opportunities to pick up on those sorts of stories as journalism just changes, the landscape changes, there's consolidation through your bodies, and it just is always changing as far as how you do the job and what that looks like. But I think even just generally, if you're looking to add and avoid redundancy, I mean, we all want to feel like we're adding something. And I think pursuing underreported stories absolutely does that. For me, I got into this to do accountability work. And if you're digging up something that other people haven't reported on or looking at it from a different angle, you're more than likely going to find that accountability angle to bring forth. And so if that's what drives you, focusing on those stories that others are not is a good way to ensure that you sort of fulfill that.
Yeah, and I think given the age that we live in, we have content flying at us left and right, on all sorts of platforms. And, with the daily news cycle, you do see the redundancies, and you see less and less underreported stories because they take time. You really have to develop some subject matter expertise. You have to do research. You have to develop sources. Big media organizations, as we well know, are capable of, fielding teams who can do that. But when we think about the role of government on your life, local government, right, it has some of the largest impact on your life or your state where you live. And, we have fewer journalists at those levels. And so, being in Pennsylvania, it's a significant state. It's a swing state. It will certainly swing potentially again in this election cycle. And we have, consolidated media outlets, but we also, have, journalists who are here in the state like us who can, base our stories here and take time to report and also look at, sourcing outside of Pennsylvania to, draw bigger conclusions and add context for, our audience.
I know for me, the way I have my phone and iPad plugged in, breaking news rolls out and I get like these 15 updates from all the media sources that I'm following. And it's kind of sometimes you're like, okay, I understand this is a big story, but everybody's covered this. Why do I need to cover this?
Totally, David. I've had that feeling many times over the years working in newsrooms. And so, yeah, I mean, I think Stephanie and I have had similar feelings or reactions to seeing so many outlets cover the same thing and cover it in the same way through the same medium. And so when we had this opportunity to decide how we wanted to focus our podcast, it seemed clear that the underreported stories were the way to go. And even prior to that, just being on different beats over the years, that it's extra work, but ultimately more rewarding to seek that out. As we've said, I think we all want to feel like we're adding something, and that's just kind of the way to do it.
So I was wondering, how you guys are thinking about structuring the series. Like, is this going to be like a year-long series, or is it 12 episodes, or how is the first series structured?
So From Words to Weapons is a bit more of an anthology. Obviously, if you've listened to it, it's not one quote unquote character driving the entire series. It's pairs of episodes, basically the first 8 narrative/reported series that is structured in a way your listeners might be familiar with if they listen to NPR, really, and their long form if they listen to Reveal, This American Life, Snap Judgment. It's similar to those structures. And, each of those is paired with a Q&A with an expert with complementary expertise to give more context and take a look at even yet another angle on the issue. And so that's how the first 8 are structured. And then we have some panels. We mentioned we've hosted a couple in-person panels, and we'll be adapting those for podcast episodes. We have some bonus Q&As, and we'll ultimately be doing sort of a capstone episode where we wrap up and include some things that didn't quite fit into the other episodes. So I guess it'll be, I think, to your point, about 12 episodes when all is said and done in the For Words to Weapons series itself. Stephanie, does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, I think you said it well.
And is this going to focus around law enforcement trauma, or is that just one possible topic?
So yes, From Words to Weapons, the series is focused on survivors of law enforcement trauma. And Obscured generally will explore other topics. We had our second episode, I believe, was Stephanie, and she can talk more about this. These will be called Obscured Revisited episodes, where we go back to our old reporting and update it, look at what happened since we last reported on the issue or were on the beat. And depending on what we find, it could be a heavier lift and maybe more than one episode, or it could be something that's a little bit quicker. Look, a fresh look at the issue.
Yes. In 2021, we put out a series about prison censorship. It's called Restricted Reading, where we interviewed different researchers, advocates in the space about this policy issue. And for the episode that Emily was talking about that's on our feed, it was during Banned Books Week this year, in early October. We did an episode and I talked with several sources, including James Tager. He's the research director at PEN America, and he had written a policy brief in 2019 called Literature Locked Up: How Prison Book Restriction Policies Constitute the nation's largest book ban. And when we talked, in 2021 for the series, he had already talked about how obscured prison censorship was from the public then, and that, sort of catching up now, 2 years later, he sees that it's even more obscured. Ironically, as the censorship, has come more into the media, in terms of, school libraries and public libraries, and decisions to censor books, it's almost, made prison censorship, it's almost pushed prison censorship to the side. And, in James' point of view, prison censorship would constitute, America's largest book ban. So we had some policy updates from James. We talked about there's a Prison Libraries Act in Congress right now that would grant more money to prison libraries. And the American Library Association is also updating its standards for library services for the incarcerated or the detained. So there's been some movement. And as Emily said, we're hoping to come back to previous reporting, we've either done together or previously in our careers, and sort of follow up on the issue. Because like Emily mentioned as well, these are the types of stories that we have covered previously over our careers.
And that's, a topic that's still pretty ripe, unfortunately.
I think so.
So how did you come to the idea of survivors of law enforcement trauma?
So I have covered excessive force and, police accountability on a previous beat, past job, and hadn't covered that in years, switched companies, even mediums since then, but was still interested in the issue, continued to follow it, and wanted to get back to it at some point should the opportunity present. So that was in my mind. And we were doing work for the At the Core of Care podcast, which Stephanie can talk a little bit more about that because that predates my time at Kouvenda. But it's essentially a podcast about nursing. I was looking to do a couple episodes on standardizing sexual assault exams across the US, and came across a forensic nurse on a conference lineup. Her presentation was about developing a protocol for survivors of law enforcement trauma. So I started off our interview, intended more as a warm-up to ask her about that, but then ended up dominating our conversation. And it was pretty clear immediately that her story and her work could certainly be involved in or the focus of our first season of Obscured, which we hadn't at that point decided exactly how to focus it. Her name is Maya Anderson. She runs the undergraduate and graduate programs for nursing at Morgan State University in Baltimore. She's the focus of episode 7. And, her vision is to create a protocol that is analogous to what one might expect to find available for survivors of sexual assault if they present, for example, in an emergency room in the hospital, where the exam's done in a certain way, there's certain questions asked, there's evidence collected, maybe law enforcement is called, although in this case, maybe not. And that's part of what needs to be figured out, is what's the right way to do this. But then also advocates, referrals for follow-up, mental health counseling, medical care, legal support, things along those lines. And so that kind of got started. And, we pick up on some of the less examined types of law enforcement trauma in our other episodes in this series.
It seems like that again is one of these underreported stories that, well, there's been a lot of focus on, police shootings and police killings and the fact that there's over 1,000 each year, but there's no focus really on the survivors. And I assume that you kind of have two different categories of survivors, or you could. One who would be the direct survivors, and then the families of people that end up killed. And I've dealt with a lot of families over the years, and they suffer their own kinds of trauma. And the other problem is when you talk about victims of violence, you have this whole system that's set around, oh, okay, you got these victims advocates and stuff, but nobody ever deals with the people that are, victims of law enforcement, because they're kind of this weird class.
Yeah, it's this dynamic of, and we hear this in the podcast episode that Emily reported in episode 7 of the series. It's, awkward to call the police on the police, right? That's real. And there's all sorts of power dynamics there and why somebody wouldn't report. And I think what Emily did a very good job of doing in her reporting in episode 7 is, telling the story through the lens of forensic nurses who, deal with this in the emergency departments, who have, victims who come in and have, had an encounter, for example, and there's no protocol for how to care for these types of victims and what to do. So definitely recommend your listeners to check out that episode, because it is one of those aha listens to your point, about you hear about these types of stories, but not this type of angle.
And I know that before he was removed from office, for instance, the San Francisco DA was starting to, create and work with the state legislature to actually, kind of formalize how victims of police violence are treated. I don't know how far that got because he got removed from office, but it might be something that you guys look into if you haven't.
So we have, I guess, looked into that to a certain extent as part of the series, just by the nature of the reporting. As far as formal legislative action at the state level, we specifically focused most on compensation for people who are wrongfully convicted, wrongfully incarcerated, and how, that in itself is a form of law enforcement trauma. I mean, the person we profiled in episode 3 was in prison for almost 3 decades for a crime he did not commit, missed all of, that time to build his life. In Pennsylvania and a handful of other states, I believe it's a dozen total, the only recourse that someone who's been wrongfully incarcerated has is to sue. All of the other states have some way, and they're not all created equally. The devil is in the details, but they have some avenue for people to pursue compensation for being wrongfully convicted. That is aside from litigation, and Pennsylvania does not do that, despite bills being introduced for at least 20 years, almost every session. So that's what we examined in episode 3, in addition to telling the story of the exoneree I mentioned, and his name is Chester Holman III.
And you guys also look into healthcare providers, and what angle are you looking at there?
We have an episode that came out on December 20th, episode 8, with a physician who talks about post-incarceration healthcare and navigating mistrust within medical, systems. And, she herself is based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And, when she worked, providing healthcare to people who were directly incarcerated. And what she saw was this, for lack of a better word, lack of humanity in the treatment that incarcerated individuals experienced when coming into a hospital for medical care. Everything from, being escorted and having police presence around them to, maybe coming in and, being shackled in some cases. And so that is an element that we talked to. Her name's Dr. Divya Venkat, and she really breaks it down and then talks about when people come out of from being incarcerated in those first few weeks, especially, they're at a higher risk of death for multiple reasons, and sort of how do you intervene and help someone transition. And then certainly in episode 7, which we've talked a little bit about with sort of the focus on forensic nurses and their care, Emily could talk more about how nurses are thinking and what they've seen in the care that they've provided.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. As I mentioned, the setup, the infrastructure for that would, at this point, the thinking is, be similar to what's in place for survivors of sexual assault, where you have an interdisciplinary wraparound setup that brings in an advocate and includes very specific medical exam protocol, the collection of evidence, and referrals for not only follow-up medical care, but mental health counseling and potentially legal advice. And so that is one aspect. The other would be just, the need for potentially anti-bias training. The nurses who I met and spoke with, they're just witnessing a real lack of empathy and a lot of bias in the way that some of their colleagues deal with people who come in custody or after they've had an altercation with police. And so those are just some of the, the things that came up in that episode, the themes, in addition to it really is a trauma-informed approach as well. So they're just pointing to a need for not only very specific protocol, but more general education and training on the specific kind of trauma-informed approach for these people who've survived law enforcement trauma.
So how can people access your podcast and be able to listen to the episodes?
Obscured is available on any major podcast platform. And there's also a site where we direct people to Podlink, and you can put in Obscured there and you can see where it's available. And it is available as well on our website, which is KouvendaMedia.com. That's KOUVENDA media.com. All
right. Well, it's been great having you guys on the show and being able to talk with you about some very interesting subject matter. Now I'm going to go back and listen to all your podcasts because they sound really fascinating.
We hope you do, and would welcome your feedback given you're doing similar work. So thank you so much for having us and for the work that you do.
We really appreciated the opportunity, David, and it was a great conversation.
We've been talking with Stephanie Marudas and Emily Previti, and this has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next week for more tales from the injustice system.
Thank you to George Powell and Norman Mousequake Barrett for the use of our opening, Everyday Injustice. You can see more of George's music at www.justiceforgeorgepowell.com. That's Justice for George Powell, all one word, .com.